so nice to see all of you on this Wednesday afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. My name is Liz Sulkin, and I'll be introducing our special guest today. I'd like to welcome you all to the Sustainability Laboratories Conversation Series. This is our 20th conversation of the series that was launched in 2021 to explore global systemic approaches to challenge of sustainability with the leading edge thinkers of our time. An archive of these conversations can be found on the lab's website. Tonight, it is my absolute privilege to introduce to you Anne Baring. Anne is a distinguished historian, accomplished author, and esteemed Jungian analyst. Her academic journey commenced at Oxford University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in modern history in 1953, followed by a master's degree in 1981. Notably, in 2018, she was conferred with an honorary doctorate in wisdom studies from Ubiquity University. During the 1950s, Anne embarked on extensive travels throughout India and the Far East before immersing herself in the field of Jungian analysis. With a 3-decade membership in the Scientific and Medical Network and an honorary affiliation with the Association of Jungian Analysts, Anne has solidified her standing as a respected figure in her field. Her expertise has been disseminated throughout lectures delivered across the United Kingdoms and the United States. In recent years, Anne has leveraged her 6 decades of research, coupled with her profound interests spanning psychology, history, politics, mythology, art, fairy tales, and alchemy to curate engaging online seminar courses. Additionally, Anne is the author and co-author of 8 seminal books, including her latest publication, Messages from a Transcendent Dimension, and the acclaimed The Dream of the Cosmos, A Quest for the Soul, which encapsulates her life scholarly contributions. We'll be sharing a link to these books in the chat. Now, I will turn things over to the founding director of the Sustainability Laboratory, Dr. Michael Ben-Eli. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Anne. It's such a huge privilege to have you with us. I've been looking forward to this mission with great anticipation. A quick word about the purpose of our conversation today. Mythologies shape and energize civilization, culture, and belief systems, and ultimately our actions in the world. Today, we would like to explore with you, Anne, how does this insight relate to where we find ourselves in the world today, and how does it relate to an urgent need for a new story that will facilitate raising humanity's awareness and consciousness and get us out of the mess that we seem to be headed for. So let's start by having you introduce yourself to our audience on a personal note. The making of Anne Baring, if you will. Please tell us about growing up, milestones in your early development, important inspirations, influences, key events, teachers, mentors, and the like. Please.
Okay, that's a tall order, Michael, but I'll begin, I think. I am half American and an American mother. And during the Second World War, I was in America with my grandmother. My mother was a huge influence on my life. She was a poet and an artist, and the house was full of her being, really. She was an extraordinary woman, and I owe everything that I am, first of all, to her art and poetry and interest in everything, and secondly, to my father's intellect, because he was extremely intelligent and a lovely man, but he was away in Europe during the war while I was in America. So when I then returned to Europe, there were 2 wonderful journeys with my mother to Italy. My first encounter with Renaissance art, which made a huge impression on me, particularly the image of the ascended Christ or the resurrected Christ by Piero della Francesca in a town called Borgo San Sepolcro. That hit me like an absolute, I don't know what really, but it changed my life being in that room with that picture. And then from the age of 13, my mother received, when I was 13, I was told about messages that my mother received through a friend from Jesus and St. Francis. And these messages went on for 25 years or so. And the gist of them was that we had to stop killing each other. Otherwise, we were in danger of destroying not only ourselves, but the planet as well. It was a very, very strong warning, repeated many times. So I was very influenced by these messages, and I had one or two which said that I had to prepare for a mission myself when I was older, which had to do with helping women. That was really all it said. So that was, out of that came my life quest, really. Then, extraordinarily, when I was just after university, when I really didn't know what to do with myself, because I felt so limited in the culture of that time. There were only 3 courses open to women: to be a secretary, to be a nurse, or to be a teacher. And I didn't really feel I was interested in any of those careers. Something else was calling me. And by a miraculous chance, I met somebody who, I think I went to Rome and met somebody there who introduced me to an encyclopedia of art, which an Italian organization was starting. And they said, would you go to the Far East and go to as many museums as possible and collect as many photographs as you possibly can with the curators and send them back to us? And we will pay you when you get back for what you've done. So off I went. It took a year, and I went to India first, and then I went to all the countries further east except China, which was out of bounds at the time. My uncle was ambassador in Bangkok at the time, and I remember I had a visa through a boyfriend in India that I got, and it arrived on his desk. And he said, "What is this? You can't possibly go to China. It's out of bounds. You'd cause an international incident, so that's out." So I had to obey him, and then I went on further with my journeys and ended up in Taiwan, as near as I could get to China, but also Indonesia, Thailand, Laos, Burma, and fascinating opening to a girl of 25 who knew nothing about ancient civilizations. And this is how I encountered, first of all, Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism also. I had a godfather who had lived for 40 years in China and who was a Taoist. That in itself was a miraculous influence on my life. And I'm just thinking, in India, I made another journey before that with my mother to the ashram of Sri Ramana, and he had died the year before, but he had a little booklet that he wanted to have everybody to have, which said, the question on it was, answer the question, who am I? So I still have that little booklet, and I have answered that question to my own satisfaction, but it's took me maybe 50 years to answer it. So that was, my encounter with the East was extraordinary, and something from, coming from a European background, knowing nothing about the East, knowing nothing about Eastern religions, it really was a revelation, and I went deep into it. And I studied the Upanishads. I read the Bhagavad Gita over and over again. I still do. And when I went back to England, I wrote all about my journeys and called it The One Work, A Quest for the Soul. And that was published in 1960. And the year after, I married an artist, a wonderful man, whom I'm still married to. And we've been married over 63 years now. And very happy, contented marriage with each of us doing our own work completely separately. But often he was painting what I was writing, and he would always read what I had written very kindly. So then I came to the influence of Jung in my life, because I suffered, not surprisingly, from deep depression, having come back from this marvelous journey to an England which was so incredibly boring at that time and stultifying, and I didn't know what to do. So I fell into a deep depression. I'd always had some depressions because I just had inherited them, I think, from my father. So I started Jungian analysis then, and I had 2 long analyses, one with a man, one with a woman, who was the wife of Dr. Gerhard Adler, who was Jung's, the man who edited his works. And that was extremely interesting because, again, it opened me to the inner world, which I hadn't really thought about, although I had the visions of it through the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and what I'd learned about the East. But now I was really beginning a whole new process of learning. And in the course of that, my creativity was blocked because I didn't know how to express what I had to have within me. And the first analysis released a tremendous longing to create beauty. And I opened a shop and designed and found people to make the most beautiful evening dresses that I could imagine. I used to go to Germany to choose all the fabrics once a year to Frankfurt. And all of this developed my ability to stand on my own feet, so to speak, earn my living. I did very well in the shop, and it went on for 12 years. And then there was a disaster in the financial world in the 90s, I think, and I had to close it. But that was okay. That was the end of that period of my life. And then I could concentrate. I was invited to become a Jungian analyst. So I became one. It took 7 years of training. But I'd already had this long analytical experience, which was a great help. And I was qualified as an analyst and practiced in London until 2000, for 15 years in London. And then I moved to the country and I began writing and lecturing much more. And I wrote The Myth of the Goddess in 1992 because I wanted to know, in the course of my analysis, Hella Adler was a marvelous teacher. And she really introduced me to the idea of why the feminine was missing, what had happened to it. So The Myth of the Goddess was really an attempt to trace the history of the feminine archetype from the Paleolithic era right up to the Virgin Mary. It was a huge work and it took us 10 years. I wrote it with Jules Cashford, who was also training to be an analyst with me. And I still am friends with her. It was a wonderful relationship. And then I wrote with Andrew Harvey, whom I met in a bookshop, and he had read The Myth of the Goddess and was very impressed with it. So we embraced each other. And then he said, why don't we write some books together? So we wrote the Mystic Vision, first of all, and then the Divine Feminine. And we should have written a third called The Sacred Marriage, but our publisher ran out of steam, so we never did that one. And then after that, I felt that the Myth of the Goddess hadn't really given me the scope that I wanted to express what I was in me to try and express. So I began to write The Dream of the Cosmos, which was published in 2013 and again in 2020 in an updated version. And I'm now completing a book on the missing feminine aspect of deity, which has been left out of the picture. We have God the Father, but we do not have God the Mother. And that's why we're in such a mess, in my view. So I think I'll end there, Michael, if that's all right with you. I've given you
this is just fine. But I want to take you one step backward, not backward, one step back. In your writing, you mentioned it fleetingly now, but you referred to a 1943 channeling method that recounted by your mother, which really encapsulates well our main themes for tonight. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how it helped shape your own work? You can be brief on that one.
Well, what happened, because I was very close to my mother and we were always talking together, she studied the stars and she also studied Kabbalah. And she had these messages, which were in about 4 books of collected pages, typed in rather bad typing of that sort of time, 80 years ago. And I kept those books. When she died, I inherited them. And I've had them in my bookshelf for a very long time, really, since 1994 when she died. And last February, I thought, well, it's not right that they should just be sitting there. I can't give them to my daughter or grandson because they're both dyslexic and they'll never read them. So I've got to get them into the world. And so I started last February dictating them with a wonderful help called something called Dragon, in which you speak into the piece of paper, so to speak, and it comes up with your words. So that saved me hours of typing, and I got through the books very quickly. And my publisher got them in May, and he brought them out in July. So there was no problem with getting them into the world because it was the same publisher who did The Dream of the Cosmos and who I've always worked for with other books that I've done. So that was how they came into the world. And it was called Messages from a Transcendent Dimension because that's what they were. And I thought maybe this will wake people up to the fact that there is a transcendent dimension And maybe they will read these messages and listen to the warnings in them, because they warned them over and over again that we must stop killing each other and we must respect the earth. And they said the trouble would start in the Middle East several times. The sands of Palestine, they said, beware the sands of Palestine. That is where the trouble, the evil will start. And here we are now at this stage when the thing has erupted in this dreadful war. And that's how the message book came to be, really. And as I said, it was published in July, and it seems to be going quite well with people who are interested. Is that what
Amazing.
You wanted to say?
Before we go to explore some of your specific views on different mythologies, can you tell us a little bit about what is the role of mythology in shaping civilization and culture, and hence driving our actions in the world?
Well, I think we have to think both of cosmology, which is our image of the universe, how we relate to the universe itself, and mythology, as you say, which is the stories that we tell ourselves, which structure our civilization. Like Christianity has structured Western civilization, Islam has structured the Middle East and that whole area. China has its own mythology. So each part of the world has developed a mythology which has had huge influence on the way the people behave, on what image they have of themselves and what their purpose here is, which actually hasn't got very far with any of the religious teachings we have or the mythologies, because we're still left with the question, who are we? Where have we come from? What are we doing here? What is our purpose, our evolutionary purpose here? And where do we go when we die? Now, those are the 4 or 5 more main questions which really lie underneath everybody's life, and why they're frightened of dying, which they shouldn't be, because there's no such thing as death except for the physical body. We can come back to that at the end. But mythology is hugely important, and particularly in the Bronze Age, and I think probably the Neolithic and the Paleolithic, people told stories all the time. They talked to the stars, possibly. They had shamanic people all the time initiating them into the fact that there was more to life than getting just a food to survive. So the shamanic tradition goes back at least to 40, 50,000 BC, and is very, very important, and is still, thank goodness, going today and getting stronger all the time as people look for answers in different directions.
So you've differentiated between several major mythologies that characterize the evolution of humanity. Let's start with the first one, the lunar area, as you call it. What period is it associated with, and what were the principal themes of the lunar culture?
Well, it started probably around 50,000 BC, but possibly before, and it lasted until the end of the Neolithic. And the principal image, the principal luminous body in the sky was the moon at that time. People studied the moon, their lunar notations going back to 40,000 BC that we know about. A wonderful man called Marshak wrote a book about it. And the moon was immensely important because it governed the gestation time of the child in the woman's womb. It governed the sort of period of when it was good to plant and to sow and to reap the crops. And it was related, the 4 phases of the moon were related to the 4 phases of life on Earth, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. So everything was related to each other through the moon. And it also governed the phases of people's lives, youth, maturity, old age, and the 3 days of the dark of the moon corresponding to death, which would be followed by a new rebirth, because rebirth was absolutely part of this whole mythology of the moon, because the moon always was reborn in a new cycle. And people assimilated that teaching really coming from the moon and applied it to their own lives.
And so you've shown how the next mythology, that of the solar era, brought about the separation from nature and the iconic dominance of the Great Father. Let's explore that one.
Yes, well, that really went from about 2000 BC, in the middle of the Bronze Age, until our present time. And it was really about the separation from nature and the development of the conscious mind, the development of the mind, the kind of mind that we have now, with its two hemispheres, the left hemisphere, which is the more sort of practical, and the right hemisphere, which is the more imaginative. And so this separation from nature was a huge break in the continuity of the lunar era and the importance of the moon, because now it was much more the importance of the sun. People were aspiring upwards, away from nature, away from the lunar understanding, away from participatory consciousness, into a different kind of consciousness, closer to what we have today. But that involved really rejecting nature and seeing nature as a threat, something that would absorb one again into a sort of amorphous unconsciousness, as it were. So they misunderstood or lost the consciousness of the lunar era and became absolutely focused on power. And this begins with the states in the Middle East, in Sumer, particularly in Sumer, when the individual cities began to fight each other. And because the population had increased, and there were probably a lot of young men with not enough to do, they were easily co-opted into armies. And so you began the phase, which has lasted until the present day, of addiction to power and addiction to fighting. And that's really summed up in the Iliad. If you want to know what that age was like, the Iliad sums it up. When men aspired to be great leaders, great military leaders, and great conquerors. So that has been the theme of this whole era, 4,000-year era. Also, it's related to the development of all the discoveries that were made as we went on, first of all with the Greeks, the scientific discoveries, and then more recently with us in the last 4 centuries, since the 17th century, we've separated really from religion and focused on the development of science. And that has been immensely advantageous in some ways, but disastrous in others. So we need to go into that as we go on, I think. So we have the mind we have today, but as somebody called Ian McGilchrist has written in his 2 great books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, which he published a few years ago, he says that we've become far too focused in the left hemisphere and we've neglected the right hemisphere. And as a result, we have a kind of mechanistic civilization, or civilizations that's not in touch with the true creativity of our psyche. And he's very worried about that and has written brilliantly about it in these enormous 2 books called The Matter with Things. So I think that that's probably all I need to say about that. It's the whole thing of war at that. For 4,000 years, we've had nothing but fighting, war, 7 great empires, beginning with the empire of Sargon of Akkad, and then going on to the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, the Roman, and coming up to the more recent empires. So the whole thing has been focused on conquest and power over other people, with terrible, terrible suffering, deaths of thousands and millions of young men who died far too young, rape of women, selling of slaves in the market. I think 10,000 slaves a day were sold in one of the Greek islands during the Greek period. So this had its light and its dark aspects. It had the pre-Socratic philosophers just before this phase, who were extraordinary men who were in touch with the inner world. And this was gradually lost after Plato and has never been regained except in individual people, in individual civilizations.
So it sounds like an aspect of that move from the lunar to the solar was also the dominance of the father, the male, And
Oh, thank you. Yes, it was. It was the era of the Great Father, and that began around 2000 BCE. We began to see signs of it. It comes into Greek mythology with Zeus being the father of all the goddesses. Instead of the great goddesses being supreme, they're now daughters of the father. And then it moves on into Babylonian mythology and the god Marduk, who kills the mother goddess Tiamat and creates the world from her dead body. Really vicious myth that had a huge influence on the whole of the Middle East for thousands of years, because it was the myth of the dragon and the hero killing the dragon, which went on through different cultures. But then we had the development of the three patriarchal religions coming out of this era, the solar era. And you had the really the cutting off of the umbilical cord with nature. When the patriarchal religions got rid of the goddess, they refused to include the goddess in their concept of deity. And when that happened, you cut the umbilical cord to nature, and you began the degradation of nature no longer being sacred. I should have said that in the lunar era, the sacredness of nature was primary, because everything came forth from the womb of the goddess. There was no creator beyond creation. That's terribly important. Whereas in the solar era, you have the Father God creating the world as something separate from himself. He is not immanent in it. He is not in every blade of grass, so to speak. So that is a huge change, which I should have emphasized. But thank you very much, Michael, for reminding me about that.
But this obviously gets even worse, much worse with the myth of the fall. You've written extensively about how the myth of the fall further accentuated the separation from nature and suppressed the role of the female mother even more. It's the time to elaborate a little bit on that.
I will. It was due. There was a great temple in Jerusalem. The first temple in Jerusalem had a shamanic tradition. And it had the goddess and the god who were, as it were, united, and together they created the world. But in 623 BCE, a group of priests called Deuteronomists took over the first temple in a coup. And the first thing they did was to get rid of the goddess. Her name was Asherah, and wipe out all traces of her. They removed her statue from the temple and the great bronze serpent that was a symbol of her power to regenerate life. And they smashed all images of her and anything to do with wisdom. Her name was Divine Wisdom and the Holy Spirit. Those were her two names. And she was also the tree of life, which connected the inner world with the visible material world. And so they then, very cleverly, you have to admire their cleverness, they created the myth of the fall, in which Eve was blamed for bringing sin, suffering, and death into the world through having tasted that apple and given it to Adam. She was blamed for being the first person who took the apple. Adam had a lesser blame because he took it after her, so to speak. And they gave the name of the former goddess Asherah, which was mother of all living, to Eve. So they demoted the sacred and put it onto a human woman, if you see what I mean. And that, in one blow, completely removed the sacredness of nature. They then created the myth of the very grim God in heaven banishing Adam and Eve to the world, which was not a wonderful world like the Garden of Eden, but a world of suffering and pain for both of them. And a very unpleasant picture was painted. And therefore, what happened as a result of that was that all women were tainted with the sin of Eve. And the Christian fathers took great delight in blaming women sitting in the church every Sunday. It's all your fault that we're suffering, so it's your sin. You were the first sinner, and you got us into this mess of living on this planet, so to speak, or living in nature, which is so hard and so difficult that we can hardly survive. So that has come right down to the present day with the misogyny that's very much still in our culture, ghastly pornography, and which young men or boys even are introduced to through the internet, and also rape ubiquitous, and particularly in war, in the suffering that's going on now in the Middle East. Rape is all part of that. So we haven't really made any progress in this sense since the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's 3,000 years. And it's an absolute disgrace that this hasn't been able to be understood and really addressed, because this is the root of all our problems at the present time, with what we've done to the material world, what we've done to nature, the kind of culture that we've created, and everything that we're facing now with the work that Michael is doing with all of those who are working with him. So we then need to move on perhaps to where this has led to.
You know, before you move there, you've documented a lot of the kind of practical and horrendous aspects of that misogyny. Maybe you can refer to some statistics or characteristics.
Statistics, I think 100,000 women were burnt at the stake in the 5 centuries of the Inquisition. There was the whole Christian era was one of war and terrible suffering and conquest in the name of God. Think about all the South American countries and the Central American countries that were conquered by Europeans, and the indigenous peoples who were forced into a kind of slavery. I'm afraid I do take a very, very gloomy view of this whole era. I see the scientific achievements. I see the great things like Galileo, Copernicus, as great landmarks in this stage. But the whole era, to me, is one of acute and terrible and unnecessary suffering because of the misunderstanding of what God wanted from its religions.
At the same time that all of this is developing, there's a more holistic kind of a more holistic perspective that has been presented by indigenous and shamanic tradition, the Kabbalah, and some others. Maybe you can talk to some of those, and especially the Kabbalah.
Yes, well, I'll start with Taoism, which really was the closest religion to stay in touch with nature, because really they understood what nature was and understood that the Taoists understood that they were part of nature. They were not separate from it. So that was most important insight of that great civilization. And it's still there in the Chinese psyche. They only have to look beneath the surface and it could come up again if they only knew what huge the inheritance that they have there. And then with Hinduism, you have the many gods and goddesses, but they're all contained within the Great Mother. I found this slide, which I thought was amazing. And then come to Buddhism, which is one of the greatest religions that exists today, which taught compassion above all. That was his great teaching. And in a very intelligent and very psychologically conscious way, really, he defined the Eightfold Path, and he defined the obstacles that stand in the way. So most extraordinary individual. And then Kabbalah, which I said originated, I think, in that first temple. I think that Kabbalah today is a survival of the first temple teaching that the Deuteronomists got rid of. But it was saved by the Essenes living in Palestine, and also by Jewish people living in the city of Alexandria, who took the traditions of the first temple and kept them alive. And gradually it came down to the teaching of Kabbalah, which exists today. So that is an extraordinary survival. To me, Kabbalah is the greatest cosmology that exists, because it has both the mother and the father in the Godhead. It has all the creative aspects coming down from the original source, but all connected with each other because they emanate. They don't descend in a hierarchical format, but they emanate, and therefore the beginning is present in the end, so to speak, or in the final creation, which is our world, or as far as we know is our world. I think it's the most marvelous teaching And it teaches that you come to it, first of all, by being drawn to it, then by studying it, and then finally experiencing it. And I think in the course of my life, I've understood that. That's what I've been doing, is absorbing the teachings of other religions. But I had a great teacher called Warren Kenton, who lived in London, and he taught me the basics of Kabbalah and gave me permission to teach it as well, for which I'm very, very grateful. And therefore, I would like to honor it, particularly in this meeting with you, Michael, because I think that if we could move to that understanding, there would be far less fighting, far less arguing over what each religion stood for or meant. And we could see that they're all part of this phase of moving upwards or inwards, rather, into the place where we're reconnected with the divine source. We become connected. We are connected all the time, but we don't know it. But to become consciously connected was what Kabbalah was all about, I think.
And that reflects also into shamanism, right? There's much to learn there from indigenous people today.
Yes, well, Kabbalah is a shamanic tradition. That's exactly what it is. And the indigenous people all over the world, in Mongolia, as much as South America, they kept alive this ancient realization that life is sacred and that the planet and all life around them was sacred. And they said, we come into the world as sacred beings, and we have to keep this sacredness all the way through. Otherwise, we really lose the purpose of our being here. And they're being listened to now. I did a 9-month course with Don Oscar Mira Quezada, who is a Peruvian shaman, about 5 years ago, which taught me a great deal. And although I never reached what I could have done perhaps with his teaching, I learned a lot and am deeply, deeply appreciative of what he taught me. And he's still teaching today.
From the little I know, I think that the early Gnostic, so-called Gnostic Christianity was very much in line with holistic thinking, and Jesus perhaps was a shaman himself until it was all hijacked by an institutional church and disappeared.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's what happened. And the Gnostics, in fact, they lamented. There was a woman called Hypatia in Alexandria, who was a great teacher there, who was murdered by a Christian mob. But she was saying that this Christian salvation doctrine is not a good idea. It's going to lead to trouble, because the whole idea of having one savior for one group of people is disastrous. And of course, it made sibling rivalry with the other religions. And also, it gave a huge inflation to the Christian church, having the only Son of God being theirs, so to speak. I'm sure that Jesus didn't want this, and he was teaching the same thing as the Buddha, basically, about love and compassion, and the fact that we're all one, we're all children of God, with no distinguishing between whether we're Christians, Jews, or Hindus, or anything. But just our existence is sacred because we are part of the divinity of the divine source.
You know, interestingly enough, in the Kabbalah itself, the very word for, I guess, the Holy Spirit, Shekhinah, is a feminine term.
Yes.
And wisdom, of course, Chokhmah, is always a feminine terms as well.
Well, that's why I think Kabbalah came from the first temple in Jerusalem, because those were the titles of the Queen of Heaven at that time. She was divine wisdom and the Holy Spirit. It's so strange that Kabbalah should hold those titles now.
So against this fascinating background, you described how the currently dominant worldview of scientific materialism, which brought so many advantages and rewards, brought us also to the brink of social and ecological disaster. Let's explore this one.
Well, to me, scientific materialism is the pits, because although they're very clever, they've lost the inner dimension. They've lost the psyche. They've told us, first of all, that the universe came into being by chance, then that we came into being by chance, both of which are nonsense, and has been proved nonsense by Jude Currivan, who's a modern cosmologist and physicist. So they got off on the wrong foot. They rejected religion, rejected spirituality, and in so doing, they focused only on the material world. And I took this picture of the Odilon Rodin, the Cyclops. To me, this illustrates scientific materialism with its one-eyed consciousness, looking down on the feminine, but not knowing that it's part of the feminine, saying that we're separate from nature, separate from the cosmos, saying that consciousness originates in the neurons of the brain, so that when we die, everything dies with us, consciousness dies with us, and that's the end of it. This is wrong. It's so utterly, utterly wrong. And we've been stuck in this philosophy or ideology for 300 years. Our children have been taught this in school and university. And the people who support it, like Dawkins, are very, very powerful and very convinced that they're right, and almost impossible to have a discussion with because they're sure they're right. I'm sure I'm right, so maybe I'm difficult too to have a discussion with. But I do know that I didn't just come into being by chance. And I do know that I have a soul, and I do know that I have a spirit or am part of spirit, and that I go on into other dimensions of the cosmos when I die. So all of that is rejected by scientific materialism, and it's a great loss because it's led us to the idea that we can master the earth, that the earth is ours to use for our convenience and for our benefit. And the indigenous people have screamed out loud, "You're wrong, this is all wrong. The earth is sacred, a sacred entity, and we are here to serve it and look after it, not to exploit it." So there's, there's a lot in there. I think many scientists are moving now to a different position, which is very helpful, and are not so rigid as they were. But certainly in my youth, when I was at Oxford, there was something dreadful called logical positivism, which was all the rage. And somebody called Freddie Eyre, I think, was the philosopher who was promoting it. And I was completely lost. I thought, what are they talking about? I don't understand what they mean and what is so important to them through this philosophy.
You hinted at some new scientific thinking. I guess that has to do with quantum mechanics and some of the new astronomy, all the new revelations from Hubble and the new camera. Can you refer to those?
Yes, I can, although I'm not a scientist, so I'm stepping on territory which I really shouldn't be. But I have followed. I did a course with Nassim Haramein in about 2014 or 15. I did a 10-week course in which I learned a huge amount about what he called the unified field. And he's just produced a paper, I think, which has gone out to all the scientific journals about 3 or 4 months ago. So he was a wonderful teacher, and I understood so much about how everything is connected at the subatomic level, at the level of what he called the Planck spherical units, which is the smallest unit of matter, so small that you can't imagine the smallness of it. But these are all connected to each other through wormholes, these tiny, tiny, tiny little particles. And through those wormholes, which are part of our organism, as it were, we're all connected to each other. And not only that, we're connected to the 3 trillion galaxies of the universe. So we are one life. And I think that is so exciting and so extraordinary. We may be an infinitesimal part of that one life, but nevertheless, we belong. And this, I think, is what needs to be coming out now in what I call the new story.
I think that also some of the amazing images that came out of Hubble first, and now they are even strengthened, of huge areas in space where actually stars are being born as we speak, indicate a completely different non-static view of universe as an evolving something, continuously evolving. So there is a living entity there rather than a static collection of objects. And that's in itself would have a huge impact on the way we think about our environment, if you want to call it that. But let's move on to the awakening, the new story. and obviously the multiple interrelated existential challenges that we face today, the sustainability challenge, if you will, call, as you have been strongly advocating for a revolutionary novel cosmology. Could you characterize the essential features of such a novel story, a revolutionary novel story that will help us move forward?
Well, first of all, it would be the restoration of the feminine archetype. This is a painting by my husband to indicate the coming of the new story. Not that he was conscious of this when he was painting it. It took him 8 years to paint, and he changed it a great deal while he was doing it. But I think this is part. We have to have a feminine archetype to balance the prominence of the masculine one, because we live in an unbalanced civilization where women have no representative at all in the deity. That's all wrong. That's been wrong for a long time. But that can be corrected, and I'm trying to correct it with my books and my lectures and webinars and things. So part of that is the restoration of the sacredness of nature that goes with the feminine archetype. And also that we have an evolutionary purpose here on this planet, which is to look after it and care for it and see that it flourishes and see that we don't overexploit it. It's extraordinarily difficult to undo what we've done, to undo the huge oil refineries, the machinery that we've put on the surface of the earth, which really hurts the earth. And in a recent message coming through the Kogi Indians in Colombia, she has spoken to say that she is suffering from what has been done to her body, and she will take steps to correct it, because she has to do that in order to restore the health that has been taken away from her. And because we are connected to the earth, we are part of the earth. If she is ill, if she's damaged, suffering, we are ill and suffering. There are all kinds of diseases that we have now that we didn't have before, and they are increasing all the time, including mental illness. And the mental illness comes from our disconnection from soul, from the fact that we don't know we have a soul, that we don't know that we have an evolutionary purpose on the planet, that we're just here for one life, and that's it. That's a terrible, terrible image to hold as one comes into life and as children grow up. They are given no meaning to their lives, no love of who they are and what is all around them. And this could be corrected very easily with education if we could get away from this scientific materialism into another way of thinking about everything, a much more connected way. And that would be the feminine archetype again, because the feminine is all about relationship. It's not about power. It's about relationship. And if that principle could be put foremost, as it were, in education, so that children would learn, first of all, how they're connected to the earth by being taken out into the woods and touching animals, touching trees, touching leaves and all that sort of thing, they would get a sense of being with the life of the earth as they grew up. And that has been done in the Scandinavian countries, I think, quite a lot. So that's really what I call the new story. And it is an evolutionary imperative, because if we miss the boat, we've had it as a species, and possibly the earth may have had it as well. And this is an utter tragedy when you think of the beauty of our planet and how many millions or billions of years it's taken to form life on it. To throw all that away through our own stupidity and arrogance and addiction to fighting and war and weapons, all that has to go if we expect to survive. And nuclear weapons was one of the huge mistakes. I should mention that the creation of the atomic bomb in 1945 has led to this nuclear race and to everything, the mess that we're in now. And it should never have come to be. People could have realized that this was an act, a sacrilegious act. He was a Nobel Prize winner in 1974 or 54, I think. And he said with the invention of the atomic bomb, we'd lost our humanity. And I think that's true. We've lost it, and we have to get it back with the help of the indigenous people. And it's all there. The material is there, as I know you know, Michael. The substance of the change is there. We simply have to implement it in any way we can. And I've been listening to a wonderful program called Unity Earth last weekend, and also going to be next weekend, where Jim Garrison is speaking, where people, 50 organizations from all over the earth are coming together to say that we have to change the paradigm that we've been living in. We have to change our relationship with the earth, and we can do it because we're really a species of genius. We have genius, and we need to apply it in a different way, not through making more things to bring us more power and more pleasure, and but huge responsibility of our evolutionary role.
Obviously, driving mythologies took hundreds of years to develop, and they're also very resistant to change. So the time dimension, I mean, that new story has to be written very, very quickly and kind of get into everybody's consciousness and awareness and heart in a lightning speed. How do you see that?
Well, I see it's been preparation in my lifetime for about 30 years, I suppose, even before that, with initiatives like Gurdjieff, for instance, Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and the Theosophical movement, and Blavatsky. And at the end of the 19th century, it was really beginning, but it took a very long time to come to fruition. But the pressure of events is accelerating our change. It has to come. And apparently these next 3 years are vitally important for this change. If we don't make it in the next 3 years, that we've had it, sort of thing. That's the message from the mother. And it's the message coming from all sorts of other people on the planet who are more aware than I am of what actually is happening, as I'm sure you are, Michael.
And what would be then your advice for the individual? How can an individual participate in composing and choreographing this new story? And what do the institutions that dominate our cultural world order have to do?
Well, that's a very big question, but I think, as the mother said, she said, the princes and the leaders and the primates and all the leaders of the world have to come together and realize and listen to me. It's time to end all these meetings, these G7 meetings that accomplish nothing whatsoever, and all these other meetings, the WEF, which is really quite satanic in its intentions, and Yuval Harari, who's spoken there, has called us hackable animals. He says we don't need God, we don't have a soul, we're just hackable animals. That has to go. We have to fight that awful concept, which really is almost, as I say, satanic. And we have to recover our connection with soul, realizing that we have a soul. Secondly, we have to realize that we're all connected. I like this image because it shows, this is called Indra's net, but it shows all the little tiny sparks of life that we are all connected through this great net of being, because that is the life that's living us. It's this net of being that we belong to and always have belonged to and will belong to after our physical death, so to speak. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful image to put before people, something to give them hope, to give them meaning, to give them trust in life instead of fear of life and fear of death, knowing that we go on, that we are in fact divine and immortal beings. This has been taught in older, like the Eleusinian mysteries, it was taught then, and it's been taught very much since then, but we don't hear about it in our culture. People would laugh and say, you're calling yourself divine, who do you think you are? But I know that's what I am, and I know I'm immortal, and that I go from life to life. I've had many, many lives on this planet, as we all have, and this should be known. One life is not enough to do anything. you just get going, and then you have to go. I'm 92, and I don't want to die at the moment because I still have a lot to do. So you have to have a sense of trust that you are being guided. That's another thing. We are guided by people in the other dimension who are tearing their hair out, such as hair is, saying, what are we to do with these human beings who just don't get it?
And you're really way beyond inspiration. It's a total honor to get to know you and to have this discussion and the others that we have had. And I look forward to opportunities, perhaps even to meet in person one day.
Thank you so much. It's been my honor and my privilege to be here with you, Michael. And thank you for telling me to speak spontaneously instead of reading. A lot.
You did very well. You did very well.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.
And be well.